She was the kind of nurse people trusted instantly. Calm voice, steady hands, eyes that promised care. Her name was Kimberly Saenz, and for years the patients of DaVita Dialysis Clinic in Lufkin, Texas, believed they were safe in her presence. Dialysis can be grueling. Hours hooked to a machine that filters your blood, surrounded by others quietly fighting to stay alive. It's a place where compassion means everything. But in 2008, something sinister began to pulse beneath the sterile calm of that clinic. It started with a spike in emergencies, sudden crashes in blood pressure, violent convulsions, alarms screaming across the ward. Veteran nurses were confused. Patients who had been stable minutes before were now unresponsive, blue, dying. At first, staff thought it was coincidence. Dialysis patients are fragile and complications happen. But then it kept happening, over and over. The same shift, the same nurse present every time. Patients would later recall seeing Kimberly move briskly from station to station, smiling faintly, adjusting lines, checking charts. Some noticed her hovering longer than necessary near certain machines. The clinic director noticed too. The numbers didn't make sense. On Saenz's shifts, cardiac arrests skyrocketed. During others, everything returned to normal. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern. And in medicine, patterns can mean everything. When one patient whispered that she'd seen Kimberly inject something into her dialysis line, alarm bells went off. The clinic quietly contacted authorities, unsure whether they were dealing with medical error or something unthinkable. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice launched an investigation, while the clinic installed hidden cameras to monitor every move on Saenz's next shift. The footage confirmed the nightmare. Kimberly Saenz was caught drawing up bleach and injecting it directly into patients' dialysis lines, a lethal act disguised as routine care. The bleach coursed through their bloodstreams, burning from the inside, destroying organs. There was no mercy, no justification, just calm efficiency. In May 2008, police arrived at the clinic and escorted her out in handcuffs. For many staff members, it was surreal. The same woman who had laughed with them in the break room, who had comforted families, now accused of murdering the people she was supposed to save. As investigators combed through records, they realized how deep the horror ran. At least 10 patients had died under her watch in just a few weeks. Dozens more had suffered unexplained complications. When questioned, Kimberly denied everything, insisting she was being framed by jealous co-workers. Her calm demeanor didn't waver, even as forensic evidence piled up. Bleach residues in tubing, irregular chemical readings, eyewitness accounts, and her own written notes detailing shifts that aligned perfectly with each medical emergency. The trial in 2012 became one of the most chilling in Texas medical history. Prosecutors argued that Saenz had developed a twisted obsession with the power of life and death. Whether it was revenge against her employer, a mental break, or a hunger for control, no one could fully explain. What haunted the courtroom was her composure. The jurors listened to surviving patients testify, describing the burning pain that ripped through their veins, the feeling of betrayal. Family members wept as they remembered loved ones who had trusted her completely. Defense attorneys tried to sow doubt. The cleaning procedures used bleach, they said. Contamination was possible. But the surveillance footage destroyed their argument. There she was, in clear view, injecting the deadly liquid into patients' lines, moments before alarms began screaming. In April 2012, Kimberly Saenz was convicted on 1 count of capital murder and multiple counts of aggravated assault. The judge's voice was steady as he sentenced her to life in prison without parole. Reporters described her expression as blank, almost detached, as if the weight of her crimes never fully reached her. Inside the Lufkin community, the betrayal was immense. These were small-town families. They brought cookies for nurses, hugged them after long sessions, trusted them with their parents' lives. To learn that one of them had weaponized compassion shattered that bond. Many survivors couldn't bring themselves to return to the clinic. Some developed panic attacks at the sight of medical tubing or disinfectant smells. In the years since, Saenz has remained largely silent behind bars. Her family rarely speaks publicly, and her former co-workers still carry guilt, wondering how they missed the signs. Psychologists studying her case described her as a rare blend of narcissism and sadism hidden behind the mask of professionalism. A reminder that even in places built for healing, darkness can thrive unnoticed. When journalists revisited the case a decade later, one patient who survived that day said something chilling. She looked at me and smiled while I was screaming. I thought it was kindness. It wasn't. Kimberly's story left a scar not just on Lufkin, but on hospitals everywhere. A warning whispered in corridors, a lesson carved into policy. Behind every syringe, every caring gesture, lies a question too uncomfortable to face. What if mercy and malice wear the same face? The night shift always carried a strange quiet. Machines hummed, monitors beeped softly, and the smell of antiseptic floated through the corridors like a ghost. At the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that silence was familiar, comforting even. But for years hidden within that stillness was a predator disguised as a caregiver. Her name was Rita Crundwell, though patients knew her simply as Nurse Rita. Calm, capable, always there when you pressed the call button. It began, as these things often do, with whispers. Between 2014 and 2018, the hospital noticed an unusual pattern. Patients who were recovering suddenly went into respiratory distress. They'd been stable hours before, talking, eating, joking with their families. Then, out of nowhere, they stopped breathing. Autopsies showed no clear cause. Their blood chemistry looked strange, elevated insulin levels in non-diabetic patients. It didn't make sense. Doctors debated endlessly. Contamination? Equipment error? But nurses began to notice that the code blues, those frantic life or death emergencies, seemed to cluster around one nurse's shifts. Rita. She was always there, calm amid chaos, quick with a syringe, whispering for the doctor, already administering something before anyone asked. When one patient, a 60-year-old man recovering from minor surgery, died suddenly after receiving a medication from her hand, the staff grew uneasy. They began to check charts comparing medication logs. What they found was chilling. Insulin doses recorded for patients who had no orders for it. The same handwriting appeared again and again. The hospital launched an internal investigation, quietly, afraid of what they might find. They reviewed security footage, traced medication pulls from the Pyxis system, and matched timestamps to Rita's login ID. The pattern was undeniable. On nights when Rita worked, vials of insulin went missing. Those nights were also when patients coded and died. Rita had been a nurse for over a decade. She was trusted, beloved by some of her patients, known for her meticulous attention to detail. She'd lost her husband years earlier to cancer, and colleagues said she poured herself into work afterward, sometimes too much. But behind the mask of professionalism lay resentment. Investigators later found journals in her locker filled with anger toward co-workers, administrators, and even certain patients she called ungrateful. It wasn't medical burnout. It was something darker. When confronted, she denied everything. She said she was being framed, that someone was using her login to cover up their mistakes. But evidence spoke louder than words. The FBI joined the case when it became clear that multiple suspicious deaths across the VA system might be linked to her. Toxicology confirmed lethal insulin doses in several victims. In 2019, federal prosecutors charged her with multiple counts of second-degree murder and tampering with consumer products. The trial was surreal. Families of veterans who had survived combat only to die in hospital beds watched the woman responsible sit calmly, her hair neatly tied back, taking notes as though this were another shift. Prosecutors played surveillance clips showing her entering medication rooms without authorization. One video captured her removing a syringe, disappearing down the hall, and returning empty-handed. Her defense tried to paint her as overworked, misjudged, scapegoated by a failing system. But when former colleagues took the stand and described her demeanor during resuscitations, the strange composure, the almost detached curiosity, the courtroom fell silent. She watched like it was a lesson, one nurse said, not like someone trying to save a life. In 2020, Rita was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The judge's words cut deep. You took those who served their country and betrayed them in their final moments. Even then, she showed little emotion, just a nod as if the verdict were a minor inconvenience. The aftermath tore through the VA community. Families demanded reforms, oversight, accountability. The hospital instituted stricter medication controls, and staff underwent new psychological screening. But nothing could erase the shadow of what happened. For years afterward, some nurses admitted they double-checked every insulin vial they touched, terrified of repeating history. Reporters revisiting the case described a strange detail that stuck with them. After each code blue, Rita had a ritual. She would go to the break room, wash her hands for a full minute, and then sit alone, staring at her reflection in the vending machine glass. Some believed it was guilt. Others thought it was pride. In prison, Rita keeps to herself. Other inmates reportedly avoid her. They say she still keeps a small notebook, writing in neat, tidy lines, the same way she charted her victims. Her crimes have become a cautionary tale in nursing schools across the country, a reminder that not all killers use weapons. Some wear scrubs. One of her former supervisors summed it up best in an interview years later. "We trust nurses with our lives because they hold the line between pain and relief." Rita crossed that line and she never came back. When the lights dim in a hospital ward and the monitors hum softly, the sound used to mean safety. But in Ann Arbor, for those who remember her, it means something else entirely. That behind the calm and the care, there can lurk a silence that kills. It was supposed to be a place of recovery. Ward 4 at Stepping Hill Hospital in Stockport, England. A quiet medical ward, lined with elderly patients, slow footsteps, soft voices, the rhythm of machines keeping fragile bodies alive. In 2011, the staff there were known for their warmth and patience, their ability to ease fear with gentle words. And among them was a nurse everyone admired, Victorino Chua. He was a father of two, originally from the Philippines, who had built a life in Britain. His colleagues called him hardworking, calm under pressure, always ready to pick up an extra shift. To many, he seemed like the kind of nurse every hospital wanted. But behind that mild smile was something no one saw coming. It began with sudden chaos. In June 2011, a series of medical emergencies began erupting across Ward 4. Patients who had been stable collapsed without warning, sweating, confused, their hearts slowing. Monitors screamed, alarms blared, and code teams rushed in. But for some, it was already too late. Their blood sugar had plummeted to deadly levels. At first, the doctors were baffled. These weren't diabetic patients. There was no reason for hypoglycemia this severe. Over the next weeks, the pattern continued, random, unpredictable, terrifying. Nurses whispered about a curse. Doctors searched for contamination, checking IV lines, food, and medication batches. Nothing made sense until one nurse noticed that the saline bags, clear, harmless-looking, smelled faintly sweet. The lab tests confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The IV bags had been deliberately contaminated with insulin. Hospital administrators were horrified. Who would do such a thing? The insulin had been drawn into syringes and injected into sealed fluid bags, invisible to the naked eye. It was an act of precision and patience. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Security was tightened, CCTV installed, and a quiet internal probe began. They kept it silent to avoid public panic. Then, on a grim July morning, another patient, 44-year-old Tracy Arden, died suddenly after showing the same symptoms. This time the police were called. A full criminal investigation began, and the hospital's corridors, once filled with the quiet sounds of care, turned cold with suspicion. Detectives combed through rosters, tracking who was on duty each time the insulin poisonings occurred. The pattern pointed again and again to one man, Victorino Chua. When police searched his home, they found a clue that froze even seasoned investigators. Inside his bedside drawer was a handwritten note, a confession of sorts, written in strange, disjointed English. It read, "I am evil. I know I will lose my job, but I will have my revenge. I can do anything if I wish." The note became the heart of the prosecution's case. Investigators discovered that Chua had tampered with dozens of saline bags, injecting insulin into them and returning them to the supply cupboard. Any nurse could have unknowingly picked one up and connected it to a patient. The randomness was part of his cruelty. It made everyone doubt themselves. In all, at least 21 patients were poisoned. 2 died directly from the insulin overdoses, while many others suffered near-fatal crashes. During the trial, prosecutors described Chua as a narcissist with a God complex, someone who wanted control over life and death. They believed he targeted his workplace out of resentment, angry about management and scheduling decisions. His defense tried to claim the confession was misunderstood, that it was written in frustration, not guilt. But the evidence was overwhelming. His shifts aligned with every poisoning, and fingerprints were found on contaminated supplies. The trial gripped the UK for months. Families sat in court clutching photos of their loved ones. listening to the sterile horror of what had happened behind those hospital curtains. Nurses wept on the stand, describing the fear that rippled through every ward once they realized the killer might be one of their own. Some couldn't return to work afterward. When the verdict came in 2015, the courtroom fell silent. Victorino Chua was convicted of 2 murders and 22 counts of attempted murder. The judge called him a cruel and calculating killer and sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years. After the verdict, one family member of a survivor said, "We always told our father the nurses would keep him safe. He believed that. He died believing that." The hospital changed forever after that. Strict security controls were introduced and staff underwent psychological evaluations before being hired. Yet no amount of policy could erase the fear that settled in the halls. Even today, some nurses still flinch when opening a saline bag, haunted by the thought that it could hold death instead of healing. Chua has never admitted guilt. In interviews from prison, he maintains his innocence, claiming he's been made a scapegoat. But his note, the one that began, "I am evil," tells another story, one written not in remorse but in pride. The tragedy at Stepping Hill became a symbol of betrayal, a reminder that evil doesn't always arrive with a weapon in hand. Sometimes it comes dressed in scrubs, holding a patient's hand, whispering, "You'll be fine." And somewhere between those words and the flicker of the monitor, life quietly slips away. She was known as the angel of the neonatal ward, a soft-spoken woman with a kind face, a gentle laugh, and hands that cradled life itself. Her name was Lucy Letby, and for years she worked at the Countess of Chester Hospital in England, caring for premature infants so small they fit in her palms. Parents trusted her completely. They sent her thank you cards, smiled when she entered the room, and felt relief knowing she was on duty. But behind those quiet blue eyes was a darkness no one imagined. Between 2015 and 2016, a series of unexplained deaths and collapses swept through the neonatal unit. Babies who had been recovering suddenly stopped breathing. Others developed mysterious bleeding or swelling overnight. The hospital investigated but found nothing. No infections, no equipment failures. The deaths were tragic, but neonatal care is unpredictable and sometimes babies don't make it. That's what everyone told themselves. Still, one consultant, Dr. Stephen Breary, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He began to notice a pattern, the same nurse present at nearly every unexpected death. Lucy Letby. He shared his concerns with hospital management, but they brushed it aside. Lucy was popular, diligent, adored by her peers. Accusing her felt absurd, but the tragedies didn't stop. In 1 month alone, 3 babies died within days of each other. When investigators examined the records, they noticed something else: unusual spikes in oxygen and air readings, and lab results showing air embolisms, bubbles in the bloodstream. Someone was injecting air into the tiny veins of premature infants. The truth emerged slowly, piece by horrifying piece. Surveillance, chart analysis, and post-mortem results built a case that chilled even seasoned detectives. The method was clinical, deliberate, and cruel. Lucy had been injecting air into babies' intravenous lines or feeding tubes, causing sudden collapses. Sometimes she used insulin. Other times she overfed them milk, watching as their fragile bodies gave up. What made it unbearable was her demeanor. After each death, she comforted the parents, attended funerals, sent sympathy cards. She even decorated the ward with cheerful drawings, pretending nothing was wrong. To the outside world, she was the embodiment of compassion. By 2018, police had opened a full-scale murder inquiry. When they searched her home, they found something deeply disturbing: handwritten notes, hidden in drawers, covered in confessions and contradictions. One read, "I am evil. I did this." Another said, "I don't deserve to live. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough." Investigators uncovered that between June 2015 and June 2016, 7 babies were murdered and 6 others attacked. Each incident coincided with her shifts. She had even swapped schedules to ensure she was present during certain nights. When she was arrested in July 2018, the hospital community was shattered. Her colleagues couldn't comprehend it. Parents of victims screamed at the news, reliving the nights when their infants slipped away in their arms while Lucy gently consoled them. Her trial began in 2022 and became one of the most harrowing in British legal history. The courtroom was silent as prosecutors detailed each death, one by one. Monitors, feeding syringes, coded chart entries. Every tool of her profession turned into a weapon. Witnesses described her as detached, cold, but occasionally smirking when evidence was read. The prosecution described her as a nurse who sought control over the most vulnerable, someone addicted to the rush of crisis, the power of resurrection, and the sympathy that followed tragedy. When babies survived her attacks, she sometimes returned days later to finish what she started. Parents took the stand, recounting the moments their newborns gasped for air. One mother said she saw Lucy standing at the incubator moments before her baby turned blue. Another described walking in to find her child's monitor turned off. The defense argued stress, coincidence, even hospital incompetence. But the evidence was undeniable. Handwritten confessions, medical data, timing that matched her every shift. After 10 months of testimony, the jury returned their verdict. Lucy Letby was found guilty of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 more. The judge sentenced her to a rare whole-life order. She will never be released. As he read the sentence, she refused to appear in court, hiding in her cell, silent and unrepentant. The public reaction was one of horror and disbelief. The image of the kind nurse with the gentle smile was replaced with that of Britain's most prolific child killer. Hospitals across the UK reviewed their neonatal procedures, terrified that such evil could go unnoticed for so long. The Countess of Chester Hospital became a place of mourning. Parents of surviving infants still wake at night, haunted by the knowledge that their children could have been next. Nurses who once called her a friend now speak her name only in whispers. Even now, no one truly understands why she did it. Some experts call it a form of medical Munchausen, creating crises for attention. Others see it as sadistic thrill-seeking. But for those who lost their children, no psychological explanation can erase the image of a nurse leaning over a crib, smiling gently as life slipped away. Her story became a dark chapter in medical history, not because she hid her cruelty behind charm, but because she hid it behind compassion. The same hands that adjusted oxygen tubes, that soothed crying parents, were the same hands that ended innocent lives. The phrase "trusted nurse" will never sound the same again. It was a small hospital in Redding, California, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where nurses stayed for decades and patients brought cookies to thank the staff. Among those familiar faces was Gwen Graham, always cheerful, always humming softly as she worked the night shift at Alpine Manor Nursing Home. She was known for her easy laughter, the way she could calm even the most anxious elderly patient. Her closest friend on staff was Kathy Wood, another nurse's aide who worked the same halls. The two became inseparable, a quiet partnership built on long nights, whispered conversations, and shared cigarettes behind the loading dock. But soon that friendship twisted into something darker, something no one in that quiet Michigan town could have imagined. In 1987, a string of sudden deaths began to trouble the administrators of Alpine Manor. Elderly patients who'd been stable were dying unexpectedly, always during the same overnight shifts. At first, no one questioned it too deeply. These were fragile lives, and loss was part of the job. Yet whispers started spreading through the staff, that the pattern was strange, that it seemed to happen when Gwen and Kathy were on duty together. What no one knew was that behind the walls of that nursing home, their friendship had turned into a secret affair, and the thrill of their romance had grown into something monstrous. Later, Kathy Wood would tell investigators that the two began to joke about killing as a game, a private ritual that would bind them together forever. Their code was simple. They called their victims the Kills, and they saw each one as a dark token of devotion. According to Wood's confession, it started with a patient named Marguerite Chambers, a sweet, frail woman who trusted Gwen completely. One night, as the hall lights dimmed, Gwen pressed a washcloth over Marguerite's face and held it there until she stopped moving. Kathy watched from the doorway, frozen. Afterward, they kissed. It became their secret, a horrifying bond sealed by death. Over the months that followed, 5 more patients died the same way. The pattern was chilling. All elderly, all suffocated quietly during night shifts, their deaths written off as natural causes. The pair even began to play games with the order of their victims, choosing names that spelled messages only they understood. They called it the alphabet game. When the deaths finally raised suspicion, both women had already left Alpine Manor. Gwen moved on, finding new work, while Kathy married a man and tried to start over. But her mind never escaped the memories of what they'd done. Guilt gnawed at her, and soon she began confiding in others, first in small hints, then in full confession. In 1988, police received a tip from Kathy's ex-husband. He claimed his wife had confessed to multiple murders at the nursing home, all committed by her and Gwen Graham. Detectives were skeptical at first. The story sounded impossible. But when they began digging, they found that the timeline matched perfectly with a series of deaths recorded at Alpine Manor. Kathy agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for leniency. She described in horrifying detail how Gwen smothered patients while she stood watch, how they laughed afterward, how they saw themselves as untouchable. Kathy even said Gwen kept mementos from the victims, small trinkets, pins, or name tags. When police confronted Gwen, she denied everything. She said Kathy was unstable, jealous, and lying out of revenge. But forensic evidence began to support Kathy's story. The victims had all died under eerily similar circumstances, signs of asphyxiation that had been dismissed as natural at the time. In 1989, both women were arrested. The courtroom was divided. There was no physical evidence tying Gwen directly to the murders, only Kathy's word. Yet Kathy's testimony was so detailed, so specific, that jurors couldn't ignore it. She described the texture of the washcloths, the way Gwen hummed while she suffocated the patients, the strange, affectionate words she whispered afterward. "It's okay. You can go now." In the end, Gwen Graham was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Kathy Wood received 20 to 40 years for second-degree murder and conspiracy in exchange for her cooperation. The story of the Alpine Manor nurses sent shockwaves through the medical world. It was the first time many Americans heard the term killer nurse. Hospitals began re-examining how patient deaths were documented and whether quiet patterns of natural deaths might hide something far more sinister. In prison, Gwen continued to maintain her innocence, claiming Kathy had manipulated the story and pinned the crimes on her. But Kathy's accounts remained consistent. She said Gwen enjoyed the feeling of power, that she'd chosen victims she saw as weak, disposable, people no one would miss. Years later, Kathy would say in an interview that what haunted her most wasn't the killings themselves, but the laughter that followed. "It was like it wasn't real," she said. "Like it was just something we did to prove we were connected." The halls of Alpine Manor have long since been renovated, the rooms repainted, new nurses hired. But for those who worked there, the memory lingers. The quiet nights, the sound of soft humming in the dark, the sudden stillness that followed. In the end, the story of Gwen Graham and Kathy Wood became a study in how love, when twisted by obsession and power, can become something monstrous. They entered the hospital to heal, to comfort, to serve. But together, they created something else entirely. A partnership built not on care, but on death. And somewhere in the cold quiet of a nursing home night, that echo of their laughter still seems to hang in the air, a reminder of how easily compassion can turn to cruelty when no one is watching. They called her Jolly Jane. She was cheerful, quick with a joke, always humming old tunes as she moved from bed to bed. To patients, she was the perfect nurse, kind, dependable, with a smile that seemed to ease pain by its very warmth. But behind that pleasant grin, Jane Toppin was quietly rewriting what it meant to be evil. Born in 1854 in Boston to a family torn apart by alcoholism and mental illness, Jane's childhood was steeped in neglect. Her mother died young. Her father, known around town as the Mad Tailor, eventually committed himself to an asylum. Jane was sent to an orphanage and later indentured to a family, where she learned obedience and charm, the kind that hides secrets. By the time she entered nursing school at Cambridge Hospital in the 1880s, she'd mastered the art of pleasing authority. Her instructors called her bright and dedicated. No one suspected what she was becoming. It started with curiosity, or that's how she described it later. She wanted to study the effects of drugs on the human system. During her training, she began secretly experimenting on patients, adjusting doses of morphine and atropine, recording how they reacted as their heart rates slowed, their breathing faltered. Some never woke up. When questioned, she blamed natural causes, and because she was well-liked, no one doubted her. After graduation, she moved between hospitals, leaving behind a trail of suspicious deaths. She developed a habit of spending long, private hours with her patients, sometimes climbing into bed beside them as they died. In later confessions, she admitted she enjoyed the thrill of holding power over life and death. and that she felt an almost intimate pleasure watching them slip away. Jane eventually began working as a private nurse for families across Massachusetts. It was then that her killings became more personal, deliberate rather than experimental. She poisoned clients with mixtures of morphine and atropine, then stayed by their bedside as they died slowly, whispering reassurances. In some cases, she killed entire households, a husband, wife, daughter, and sister, one after another. Her downfall began in 1901, when she was hired to care for the Davis family in Catawmet. Within weeks, 3 members of the household were dead. The family's doctor grew suspicious and ordered an autopsy. Toxicology tests revealed morphine poisoning. When confronted, Jane insisted she'd done nothing wrong. But investigators soon uncovered a pattern. Everywhere she'd worked, deaths had followed. When police searched her belongings, they found a small notebook containing the names of patients, cryptic notes, and dosage records that matched fatal poisonings. She was arrested, and under questioning she began to talk, freely, almost proudly. She confessed to killing at least 31 people, though some historians believe the number was much higher. What shocked detectives most was her composure. She described her methods in detail, explaining how she loved to bring her victims to the edge of death, revive them briefly, and then send them back into unconsciousness, just to prove she could. "It was like playing God," she said, smiling faintly. "Only I was better at it." Her trial in 1902 drew national attention. Newspapers called her America's first female serial killer and the Angel of Death. The courtroom was packed as witnesses described how she charmed everyone she met. Her lawyers argued insanity. Doctors agreed. She was declared not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to the Taunton Insane Hospital for life. Inside the asylum, Jane continued to revel in her infamy. Nurses reported that she bragged about her murders, claiming she wanted to kill more people than any man or woman who ever lived. She often said she'd have killed even more if she hadn't been caught. Patients and staff avoided her. Even among the mentally ill, she was feared, too intelligent, too calm, too aware. Over the decades, her legend grew. In medical schools and nursing programs, her name became a whispered warning about the dangers of unchecked trust. She had looked like the perfect nurse, compassionate, competent, devoted. But beneath that exterior was a void that found pleasure in the flicker of dying eyes. Jane Toppin died in 1938, still confined to the hospital where she'd spent nearly 4 decades. By then, her story had faded from headlines, but her shadow lingered in the world she'd helped define, a world that had to learn, painfully, that not every smile in a nurse's uniform means safety. One of her psychiatrists once wrote that Jane killed not from anger, not from necessity, but from joy. And perhaps that is what makes her story so terrifying. The idea that someone could find happiness in the taking of life, wrapped in the tender disguise of care. Even now, more than a century later, her legacy remains one of the darkest in medical history, a reminder that behind the walls of trust, behind the white uniform and gentle tone, there can hide a predator who kills not because she must, but because she can. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. In the small town of Lufkin, Texas, a woman named Kimberly Saenz walked the sterile hallways of the DeVita dialysis clinic with the calm, efficient rhythm of someone who had done it 100 times. Patients greeted her by name. She smiled, adjusted IV lines, checked blood pressure, and offered comfort. She was a nurse people trusted, and that trust would become her most dangerous weapon. It was 2008 when things at the clinic began to change. Patients who had been stable for months suddenly began suffering from mysterious reactions during treatment: nausea, shortness of breath, cardiac arrest. Some collapsed mid-session, convulsing as nurses scrambled to help. Over a span of just a few weeks, several patients died. It seemed unthinkable. Dialysis was supposed to save lives, not take them. At first, no one suspected foul play. Machines malfunction. Reactions happen. But then the patterns started to appear. The same nurse was always nearby. The same quiet figure moving between patients, sometimes staying late, sometimes cleaning equipment herself when others were told to leave. Her name kept coming up: Kimberly Clark Saenz. Saenz had been hired just a year earlier, despite a rocky past. She had been fired from multiple nursing jobs, sometimes for falsifying records, other times for conflicts with coworkers. But in healthcare, staff shortages often mean second chances. The DeVita clinic took her on, hoping she'd do better here. For a while she did. Then the deaths began. When paramedics were called repeatedly to the same facility, hospital administrators took notice. The clinic was temporarily shut down, and the Texas Department of Health launched an investigation. Inspectors discovered irregularities in chemical logs and reports of chlorine exposure, something that should never happen in dialysis. The water used for the machines must be free of even trace amounts of chlorine. Otherwise, it becomes lethal. Co-workers began whispering. One remembered seeing Saenz draw bleach from a storage area. Another recalled her cleaning dialysis lines in ways that seemed unnecessary. It was only after a patient collapsed mid-treatment, gasping for air, that a technician noticed Saenz had been near the machine seconds before. That moment changed everything. Investigators installed hidden cameras in the clinic. They watched as Saenz moved from chair to chair, appearing to inject something into the dialysis lines. Each time, within minutes, patients went into distress. When police confronted her, she denied everything, claiming she had only been cleaning equipment. But tests on the tubing told a different story. High concentrations of bleach were found in several lines. The case shocked the medical community. Prosecutors built a timeline showing that in less than a month, Saenz had poisoned at least 10 patients, 5 of whom died. The motive? No one could say for sure. Some speculated that she enjoyed the chaos, the attention, the adrenaline of resuscitation attempts. Others thought it might have been resentment, frustration with the monotony of her job, anger toward management, or a need to control life and death in a place where she felt powerless. Her trial in 2012 drew national attention. Survivors testified about the horror they experienced, how their blood seemed to burn during dialysis, how they saw Saenz hovering near them moments before the pain began. The prosecution described her as a predator in scrubs, a woman who weaponized bleach and trust in equal measure. One patient, who narrowly survived, recalled her expression, calm, detached, almost curious. She didn't look scared, he said. She looked like she wanted to see what would happen. When the verdict came, it was clear. The jury found her guilty of capital murder of 5 patients, aggravated assault of 5 others, and tampering with evidence. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In interviews afterwards, Saenz insisted she was innocent. They wanted someone to blame, she said. It was easier to blame me than to fix their machines. But the evidence was overwhelming. Her fingerprints on the syringes, her presence in every fatal incident, the chemical traces that led straight back to her hands. Behind bars, Saenz has become a ghost of her former self. Fellow inmates say she rarely speaks, keeping to herself in the prison infirmary where she once might have worked. She's banned from any medical duties, her license permanently revoked. Yet in the eyes of the law and the families she destroyed, silence doesn't equal remorse. The DeVita Clinic eventually reopened under new management, but the town never fully recovered. For the families of the victims, dialysis chairs became symbols of betrayal, places where their loved ones trusted a nurse to help them live, only to be handed death through an IV line. To this day, former patients of the clinic describe lingering fear whenever they enter a treatment center. It's not just about the machine anymore, one said. It's about who's standing beside it. Kimberly Saenz will likely die behind prison walls, her name forever tied to one of the darkest chapters in American nursing history. But her case left behind a haunting reminder. In the quiet hum of a hospital, where life depends on the touch of another's hand, one act of malice can turn healing into horror. When asked once why she thought people believed she could do such a thing, Saenz replied, "Because I was there every time." And sometimes that's all it takes, being there, when death shouldn't be. In the early 1990s, the corridors of Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey carried the same sounds as any other hospital. Rolling gurneys, beeping monitors, murmured voices of the sick and the hopeful. But beneath that hum of routine, a quiet terror was unfolding. Patients who should have been recovering began dying inexplicably, one after another. No one could make sense of it, until investigators finally realized that the deaths were connected, and that a nurse named Charles Cullen had been standing over them all. He didn't look like a killer. Thin, pale, soft-spoken. He moved gently, spoke quietly, and rarely made eye contact. To most who worked with him, he was strange but harmless, a lonely man who kept to himself. But the truth would eventually reveal something monstrous. Charles Cullen was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, with an estimated 40 confirmed victims, and likely hundreds more. Cullen's career spanned 16 years and 9 hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Everywhere he went, death followed. He began his nursing career in the late 1980s after serving in the Navy, where his mental health issues had already surfaced. He had been disciplined several times for bizarre behavior, including breaking into a commanding officer's room and wearing a surgical mask filled with chemicals. Yet when he left the military, hospitals welcomed him. They needed nurses, and Cullen seemed competent enough. His pattern was always the same. He would work overnight shifts, often alone when supervision was light. He administered drugs without orders, tampered with IV bags, and slipped lethal doses of digoxin, insulin, or epinephrine into patients' lines. The victims ranged from elderly patients near death to young people expected to recover. There was no clear motive, no pattern of mercy. When asked why he did it, Cullen once said, "Because I could." The deaths were subtle. On paper, they looked natural. Cardiac arrests, complications, organ failure. Hospitals, fearing lawsuits and scandal, avoided investigations. Instead, they quietly dismissed him. But every time Cullen was forced out, another facility hired him. There were no centralized databases, no background checks that followed nurses from state to state. He carried his deadly habits like a shadow, hidden in plain sight. By 2003, when Cullen was working at Somerset Medical Center, the body count had grown. The hospital's computer system began flagging suspicious medication activity. Drugs being ordered for patients who didn't need them, or after they had died. Pharmacists noticed that Cullen was accessing the drug Pyxis machine at odd hours, sometimes pulling medications for patients he wasn't assigned to. When one patient died suddenly after receiving a dose of digoxin, a pharmacist named Eddie grew suspicious and alerted administrators. But instead of calling police, the hospital launched an internal review. Meanwhile, more patients died. Cullen later admitted that by the time Somerset began investigating, he knew he was about to be caught, and he couldn't stop. In December 2003, after months of mounting evidence, police arrested him at his home in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. During interrogation, Cullen sat quietly for hours, refusing to speak. Then, almost casually, he began to talk, not about one murder, but dozens. He recited names, medications, hospitals. The detectives could hardly keep up. When asked for a motive, he said he had been trying to end suffering, but his calm tone betrayed the lie. Many of his victims weren't terminally ill. Some were improving. His real reason seemed to be control, the godlike power of deciding who lived and who didn't. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a staggering number of deaths that coincided with Cullen's employment at different hospitals. Records showed impossible coincidences, spikes in fatalities during his shifts, unexplained medication anomalies, missing drug vials. A full investigation revealed his trail stretched back over 16 years, with at least 29 confirmed murders and suspicions of many more. In 2006, Cullen pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. He avoided the death penalty by agreeing to cooperate, helping authorities identify some of his victims. During sentencing, family members of the dead filled the courtroom. When given a chance to speak, Cullen repeated a single phrase over and over. "Your Honor, you need to step down." He said it 17 times, a cold, mechanical chant as if mocking the grief surrounding him. The judge ordered him to 11 consecutive life sentences without parole. Inside prison, Cullen remains a figure of unsettling normalcy. He reads, writes letters, and has been known to give occasional interviews. He once said he doesn't see himself as a murderer, just someone who made mistakes. But the sheer number of his victims contradicts any notion of remorse. The FBI later estimated he may have killed up to 400 patients during his career, making him possibly the deadliest healthcare worker in American history. His case changed hospital protocol nationwide. The scandal led to the creation of new laws, Cullen laws, requiring hospitals to report suspicious behavior and share disciplinary records of medical staff. It exposed how institutions valued reputation over truth, allowing a murderer to move freely for nearly 2 decades. For the families, there's no comfort in reform. Many never learned how their loved ones died or why. Their memories of hospital rooms and IV lines are forever stained by the possibility that kindness itself became the instrument of death. In the sterile world of medicine, trust is sacred. Charles Cullen shattered it. He looked like a man of care, whispered words of comfort, adjusted pillows, and smoothed sheets, all while ending lives in silence. And as he sits in his prison cell, he represents a nightmare that medicine will never forget. The nurse who healed by day and killed by night, for reasons even he could not explain. In the quiet suburbs of Tyler, Texas, the hospitals once whispered her name with unease. Genene Jones, small, cheerful, seemingly devoted, was a pediatric nurse who carried herself with maternal energy. She sang to babies, comforted anxious parents, and stayed beyond her shifts. To the untrained eye, she was everything a children's nurse should be. But beneath that mask of compassion lay one of the most chilling chapters in American medical history. A nurse who killed the very children she was trusted to save. It began in the late 1970s at Bexar County Hospital, now known as University Hospital in San Antonio. Jones was part of a new generation of pediatric nurses trained to handle medical crises. She thrived in the emergency setting. Adrenaline steadied her hands, not shook them. But doctors noticed something strange. During her shifts, the code blue alarms, signals for cardiac or respiratory arrest, went off far more often than usual. Babies who had been stable suddenly stopped breathing. Some recovered. Others didn't. At first, it seemed like bad luck. Hospitals can be unpredictable, especially in pediatrics. But soon, whispers began. One doctor reportedly joked darkly, "Don't let Genene near your patients if you want them to live." What no one knew then was that Jones was deliberately pushing those babies into crisis, only to bring them back, basking in the glow of being a hero. She injected infants with heparin and succinylcholine, drugs that could cause uncontrolled bleeding or paralysis. When the babies stopped breathing, she was the first to respond, shouting for help, performing CPR, demanding attention. Parents praised her bravery. Colleagues called her a lifesaver. But the pattern was too sharp to ignore. The death rate in her unit skyrocketed. In 1981, the hospital quietly asked for her resignation. No investigation, no police. Like so many before her, she was allowed to move on. And she did, taking a job at a small pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas. There, the pattern repeated almost instantly. Babies who should have gone home healthy began dying suddenly. Then came Chelsea McClellan, a bright-eyed 15-month-old girl who came in for a routine vaccination in 1982. Minutes after Jones administered the shot, Chelsea's body went limp. Panic erupted. Jones performed CPR, but it was useless. Chelsea was pronounced dead within hours. Her mother, still in shock, remembered Jones saying softly, "Sometimes these things just happen." But the clinic doctor wasn't convinced. He ordered an autopsy, which revealed traces of succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic agent never meant for routine pediatric use. Investigators began piecing together a timeline of Jones's career, matching her presence with unexplained deaths. The evidence pointed to one horrifying truth. Genene Jones had likely murdered dozens of infants. When confronted, Jones showed no remorse. She denied wrongdoing, claiming she was being scapegoated. But in 1984, she was convicted of murder for Chelsea McClellan's death and injury to a child in another case. The court sentenced her to 99 years in prison, followed by another 60 years for the second conviction. During the trial, prosecutors revealed her twisted motive. They believed she was creating medical emergencies to make herself look indispensable, the nurse who always saved the day. She wanted recognition, attention, control. It was a God complex wrapped in a nurse's smile. Her actions forced hospitals nationwide to confront a grim reality. By prioritizing reputation over transparency, they had allowed a killer to roam freely through pediatric wards. After Jones's conviction, the hospital destroyed thousands of medical records, a decision that may have erased evidence of dozens of additional murders. Experts now estimate she may have killed up to 60 children. For decades, Jones sat in prison, aging quietly, largely forgotten. But in 2018, the state of Texas, fearing her potential release due to mandatory parole laws, reopened her case. New charges were filed for the murders of several more infants under her care in the early 1980s. Prosecutors vowed she would never walk free again. During a court hearing, now in her late 60s, Jones appeared frail but unrepentant. When asked if she felt remorse, she simply said, "I didn't do anything wrong." Her face was calm, almost bored, the same composure she had shown as infants died in her arms. For the families, time has done little to dull the horror. Some parents spent decades believing their children died from medical complications, only to learn later they had been poisoned by the nurse who smiled at them in the hallway. Others refused to return to hospitals at all, their trust in the system permanently shattered. In 2020, Jones pleaded guilty to the murder of an 11-month-old boy named Joshua Sawyer, adding another life sentence to her punishment. She will die behind bars. But her legacy lives on in every hospital policy, every background check, every whisper that reminds staff what happens when suspicion is silenced by comfort. Genene Jones is a name now spoken with disgust, but also with warning. She taught hospitals that evil doesn't always wear a mask of rage. Sometimes it wears a stethoscope, sings lullabies, and pretends to heal. And in the softest rooms of all, the nurseries of the sick and helpless, she found her victims among the smallest hearts, in the moments when trust was absolute. No one knows the true number of children who died beneath her hands. But the story of Genene Jones remains a chilling reminder that even in places built for healing, some come not to save, but to destroy. The hallways of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia, were supposed to be places of quiet dignity, where those who had served their country received care, compassion, and respect in their final years. But between 2017 and 2018, something sinister began to unfold behind the sterile curtains and beeping monitors. Veterans who had been recovering, stable, even cheerful, began dying suddenly in the middle of the night. No one could explain why, until investigators discovered that the nurse responsible for their care, Rita Mays, had turned the hospital into her private killing ground. She wasn't the kind of person you'd suspect. In her late 40s, Rita was known as a hard worker, dependable, quiet. Co-workers said she was kind to the patients, especially the older men, many of whom reminded her of her own father. She laughed easily, often brought in baked goods, and spoke with a soft Appalachian drawl that made her sound trustworthy. But beneath that surface calm was a darkness that would take 7 lives and leave a trail of grief stretching across the nation. The first death seemed random. An elderly veteran with congestive heart failure, another recovering from pneumonia. Both had been doing well, showing signs of improvement. Then, without warning, they went into sudden hypoglycemic shock, a drastic, unexplained drop in blood sugar. Doctors were baffled. These patients weren't diabetic. They hadn't been given insulin, but the pattern repeated. Again and again, men who should have survived their hospital stays were dying from insulin overdoses that made no medical sense. It was only after an internal review that the common thread emerged. All of the deaths occurred during Rita Mays' shifts. At first, she denied everything. When questioned, she appeared confused, even hurt that anyone would suspect her. But as investigators from the Department of Veterans Affairs and the FBI dug deeper, they uncovered the truth. A quiet, deliberate series of murders committed by someone who seemed to find satisfaction in watching life slip away. Over several months, Mays had administered unprescribed doses of insulin to elderly patients, even those with no history of diabetes. She'd often sit with them afterward, watching as they grew drowsy, confused, and then unresponsive. Some of her victims suffered for hours before slipping into comas. Others died within minutes. Her motive remains a mystery to this day. Psychologists who examined her described a woman with a desperate need for control, perhaps fueled by resentment, boredom, or the emotional weight of working in a place surrounded by death. In court, prosecutors argued she found a dark thrill in the act, a sense of power in deciding who lived and who didn't. As the investigation widened, Mays was quietly removed from duty while the hospital and federal authorities reviewed medical charts. They identified a total of 7 confirmed murders and at least 1 attempted murder, all linked to her. The victims were veterans ranging in age from 81 to 96, men who had fought in wars, survived unimaginable hardship, and come home believing they were safe. When confronted with the evidence, insulin found in the bodies of non-diabetic patients, surveillance records, and her access to medication, Mays finally confessed. Her words were chillingly simple. I did it. But when pressed for why, she had no answer. In 2020, she stood before a federal judge in a quiet West Virginia courtroom. Family members of the victims filled the seats, clutching photos of fathers and grandfathers in uniform. Some wept, others glared at her in silence. Mays, wearing a drab orange jumpsuit, spoke softly through tears. I don't know why this happened, she said. There's no excuse. I can't explain it. I can only say I'm sorry. But her apology couldn't touch the devastation she'd caused. One victim's daughter told the court, "You were supposed to protect him. You watched him take his last breath and you knew it was your doing." Another said, "You didn't just kill my father. You killed our trust in the system that was supposed to honor him." The judge called her crimes beyond comprehension and sentenced her to 7 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 20 years for the attempted murder. He told her she would die in prison, and that was only fitting, because her victims never got to live the lives they had earned. After the sentencing, Mays was transferred to a federal facility where she remains under constant watch. She is not allowed to work in the infirmary, nor to come near medical supplies. Inmates refer to her as the nurse, though not with respect. In the hierarchy of prison morality, even killers have their boundaries, and Mays crossed one too many. Her case prompted sweeping reforms in the VA system, new checks on medication access, stricter staff monitoring, and improved reporting channels for suspicious deaths. But for the families, the damage is permanent. Some veterans' widows still visit the graves every week, leaving small American flags, still asking the same question: how could someone entrusted with care betray that trust so completely? When the FBI closed the case, an agent described her as a silent predator. No dramatic motive, no confession of ideology, just a quiet, methodical cruelty masked by the uniform of care. Rita Mays will never see the outside world again. She spends her days in the same kind of structured routine she once oversaw at the hospital. Locked schedules, fixed meals, controlled medication. The irony isn't lost on those who knew her story. The woman who once dictated who received insulin and who didn't now lives in a place where every pill, every dosage, every movement is dictated for her. Her crimes left a scar on the image of nursing itself, a reminder that even the purest professions can harbor those who seek control, not compassion. In a world that depends on trust, her story is a haunting example of what happens when trust becomes a weapon. In the quiet village of Hyde, England, there was once a doctor whose name came to define medical evil, Harold Shipman. But few remember that his path of darkness found echoes among those who worked beside him, and none embodied that echo more chillingly than Beverley Allitt, a pediatric nurse whose hands became instruments of quiet devastation. The story begins in 1991 at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire. The children's ward was a place of bright murals, soft toys, and the hum of medical monitors, a space designed for hope. Parents felt safe leaving their children there. The nurses were kind, reassuring. Among them was a 22-year-old trainee nurse, Beverley, with a round face, a gentle voice, and a tendency to hover near the sickest patients. She seemed devoted, almost overly attentive. But within a matter of weeks, the ward would turn into something unimaginable. A place where healthy children mysteriously began to collapse without warning. The first incident came on February 21, 1991. A 7-week-old baby named Liam Taylor was admitted with a mild chest infection. Under Beverley's care, he suddenly suffered a cardiac arrest. Doctors managed to revive him, but he relapsed the next day. Despite desperate efforts, he died. His death was recorded as natural. Staff were shaken but moved on. Such tragedies, though rare, were part of hospital life. Then it happened again, and again. Babies who had been expected to recover began suffering respiratory failure or cardiac arrest, sometimes just minutes after Allitt was left alone with them. She was there every time. She often discovered the child in crisis, raising the alarm, crying, playing the part of the horrified caregiver. Between February and April of 1991, 4 children died and 9 others were severely injured under her watch. The ward was in chaos. Staff whispered about a curse, about something in the air. Doctors ordered tests on equipment, oxygen lines, even the water supply. Everything came back normal. The only constant, though no one dared to say it aloud, was Beverley Allitt. Eventually, one sharp-eyed consultant began to suspect foul play. Blood tests revealed unusually high levels of insulin in some of the victims, and traces of potassium chloride in others, substances that can stop the heart almost instantly. The hospital called police. Forensic specialists found evidence that these drugs had been administered intentionally. When detectives examined Allitt's background, they found troubling patterns. As a teenager, she had been known for frequent hospital visits, often for vague or self-inflicted ailments. Psychiatrists later identified this as Munchausen syndrome, a condition where someone feigns illness for attention. But in her case, it had evolved into something even darker. Munchausen by proxy, where the caregiver induces illness in others to play the savior. Confronted by investigators, Allitt denied everything. She wept. claiming to be confused and hurt that anyone could accuse her. But as the forensic evidence mounted, her lies unraveled. She was charged with 4 counts of murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, and 11 counts of grievous bodily harm. The trial revealed a staggering pattern. In just 59 days, she had attacked 13 children using insulin, potassium chloride, and even suffocation. Prosecutors described her as a nurse driven by the need to cause suffering so she could be admired for saving lives. Experts called her a medical sadist. During trial, she often sat emotionless, doodling on paper as parents described watching their children die. One father recalled her comforting him moments after his son's death, only to later learn she had likely caused it. The jury found her guilty in 1993. The judge, stunned by the cruelty and the vulnerability of her victims, sentenced her to 13 life sentences, recommending she never be released. She was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility reserved for Britain's most dangerous offenders. There, Allitt continued to manipulate those around her, feigning illness, self-harming, and seeking medical attention. Over the years, she became a case study for criminal psychology, representing a rare and terrifying intersection of care and cruelty. Doctors studying her described her actions as a need to be indispensable, a hunger for control that turned compassion into a mask. The aftermath of her crimes sent shockwaves through Britain's healthcare system. Hospitals re-examined hiring practices, supervision policies, and medication protocols. The Allitt inquiry found systemic failures, overworked staff, lack of oversight, and a dangerous willingness to dismiss suspicions out of fear of confrontation. But reforms couldn't heal the families she destroyed. Parents spoke of lifelong guilt, of trusting the nurse who smiled as she murdered their children. Many still keep photos of their babies beside hospital discharge forms, reminders of lives stolen too soon. Years later, when journalists asked Allitt if she regretted her actions, she gave a faint smile and said, "I don't remember doing anything wrong." That small phrase sent chills through everyone who heard it. It wasn't defiance, it was detachment. Today, Beverley Allitt remains confined, aging behind the walls of Rampton. Occasionally, her case resurfaces in the media, often alongside names like Harold Shipman or Charles Cullen, symbols of trust corrupted. Her story is still studied in nursing schools, not as history, but as a warning. Because her victims were infants, children who couldn't speak, couldn't tell anyone what was happening. Her crimes embody the purest form of betrayal. In the place meant to preserve life, she found meaning in ending it. And in the role meant to comfort, she found power in control. The nurses who remember working with her say they still wake up some nights to phantom alarms, to the sound of her footsteps in the ward. And every parent who handed over a child to her care carries that unanswerable question. What makes someone like that smile while taking a life too small to defend itself? For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive. And remember, in the world of true crime, sometimes the people we trust most are the ones we should fear the most.